Thank you all for being here. This is our third Visiting Artist Series event for this year. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Alison Ruttan. Later today, beginning 1 p.m., she will also give a critique and a demonstration in the ceramic studio in MAC 166 on surface treatment. Alison Ruttan is an interdisciplinary artist working in ceramics, drawing, photography, and video. She has a long-standing interest in experimenting with the language and forms borrowed from one discipline that are then applied to another. Alison is particularly interested in the complex kinds of social exchanges that are best understood visually or at the level of physiological response. For this reason, much of her work has focused on appetite, sexuality, and aggression. At present, she is involved in a long-term ceramic sculpture series that is following the conflicts in the Middle East. Alison's work has been exhibited in Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Chicago Cultural Center, Crystal Bridges Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Gallery Wit in the Netherlands, Rocket Gallery in London, the Drawing Center in New York City. Her work has been written about in Art in America, Flash Art, Chicago Tribune, Art Papers, Chicago Magazine, and the New Art Examiner. Alison is an associate professor of contemporary practices at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Alison Ruttan.
So I'm going to be talking primarily about two projects today, but I'm going to be beginning with a series of work that preceded the ceramic work, and I think it may give you kind of an idea of how I work. I think of myself as an artist primarily, not medium specific. I think of what I do as having a kind of clear trail of inquiry, that I'm working usually from a set of questions that guide my practice. The 4-year war at Gombe was started soon after, a couple years after 9/11, that 9/11 affected my work considerably. And I had been working in video and photography that was looking at instinct, and I was looking at sex and behavior. And after that, I began working with the aggression, and particularly kind of looking at the origins of human violence. And I started thinking about the way if you strip away the recent human behavior and you go back in evolution, we're going to be looking at primate behavior, and bonobos and chimpanzees are our closest relatives, and many of the traits that we have, they also have. Both of us are what are called the newer primates, that we both evolved from an earlier primate, and so traits that we have in common with chimpanzees are kind of hardwired into our behavior and kind of hard to change. So my interest in this took me to Yerkes Primate Research Station in Atlanta, where Franz de Waal teaches. It also brought me to the zoo in Wild Animal Park in Escondido, and I was able to observe bonobos. My interest in this was I was beginning to plan a project in which I had transcribed Jane Goodall's research on aggression into a screenplay that never made it into film, but it did make it into a very large photographic series. And I was going to these different research areas to kind of look at the way the animals interacted socially, and I would incorporate this into this series. So this is an image from the Chicago Cultural Center, and you can see that it's installed kind of like large chapters or the pages of a comic book or maybe a stained glass window. that there are multiple cells that you kind of read the story in these kind of image clusters. This is a picture of Jane Goodall, and the story that I was primarily interested in was her research on chimpanzee aggression and a civil war that she witnessed 10 years after she began her stay at Gombe. And the map on the left shows you where she discovered several murders. And so the series that I make follows her research from the pastoral beginnings of when Goodall first arrived, and then to the what's called the 4-year war at Gombe, in which a group that had lived together peacefully for many years split into two, and the original group, over a period of 4 years, hunted down and killed every one of their former members of their community. And when I read about that, I ended up thinking that this is like Rwanda, this is like the Civil War, this is like the Balkans, this is like our story. And because Goodall's research is often told with names versus chimp number one, that she actually gives background on the particular histories, it really felt very close to ours. And so part of the research is that in bringing the story so that it would help us to kind of see the connection, I borrow a lot from art history. There's a Corot on the top and a Versailles picnic, a kind of hippie couple from the 1960s. And these were kind of the source materials I used for the pastoral images. This is some of the research that I did on different ways of posturing. You know, that the one on the left is actually Everett, who is showing Gigi that he is interested, and he just kind of stands there passively and waits for her to kind of react. And then Everett is over there on the right as well, in a aggressive posture. So the first sequence was shot along the Des Plaines River. How many of you spent time along the Des Plaines River? Yes. And it's not the most beautiful parkland. In fact, that's kind of why I picked it, because it has kind of a morbidness, I thought, to it. A lot of rotting, stinking mass. It seemed perfect for my story. So here we have the Caselica community before the war, and the first one is the Woodlands. This is the opening scene where we see the intact community. Many of the characters, they'll show up later in different scenes. You have two boys who are dragging a large branch in and around the clearing. And this is Flo. She was an important female that Goodall wrote about. And there's this kind of serene quality and the lush green landscape, which really kind of fit this kind of pastoral. And this one is called the Meadows. And, you know, some of this is the setup to what happens before. And so you have, you know, images like this one, which are really sweet. But it quickly kind of darkens. This one is called Premonition, and it has a sense of foreboding that permeates the group. And the foreboding was actually a lot of pre-Raphaelite paintings were looked at, the kind of smoky colors. You can see it in the woods here, where you know you have these lush greens and decomposing matter, and it also kind of reminds me of the Brothers Grimm and the kind of dark woods. And then the murders began. So this one is called Charlie, was later found face down in the stream. And this is Goody, was surprised while eating his lunch. This is Day and Little B had been on a consort when they were attacked. Just some background information on that is that if you are a lower ranking chimp, that you don't really get to have sex unless you figure out a way to be sneaky about it, because the top chimps usually dominate. So what the lower ranking males usually do is try and convince a female to go on basically a vacation with them and kind of get them to go off somewhere else. Which is what Day did, and unfortunately it also left him isolated, and he had a brutal ending. His date was pulled back into the tribe, and she repeatedly ran away, actually, which kind of reminded me of in the story, in the movie The Last of the Mohicans, where the girls are trying to leave. There's so many pieces within the series that have almost filmic moments and connections to other parts of kind of human tragedy. And here is Goliath. Goliath had once been a leader of the Kasakela group, and he was one of the ones who had left the group, and his murder was probably one of the most brutal of all. I think it was because it was more personal. Here's kind of some night intimacy, and this particular image was shown in one of the science magazines, and there was a number of scientists who had written to me afterward because they said, I have this absolutely right, that there's a particular group of chimpanzees that Goodall studied that find that this particular gesture is something that's culturally kind of, I think they think it's cool to kiss this way. And you'll notice the mouth is all the way over the other mouth, almost up to the nose. And that is Gigi. Gigi is in many of the images. And if you end up reading any of Goodall's books, you'll note that I think Goodall had a fondness of her because she was kind of a fierce female who would go along with the males on many of the hunting raids and participate. And so this is Things Go Bad with 3. And here's where that Everett image is inserted. And you can see this other image here. The final image is called Honeybee Watches the End Come for Willy Wally. I love these names too. But Honeybee is perhaps the only survivor. And Honeybee, they think that she may have been absorbed into another chimpanzee group because she was an adolescent and at an age where she could fit into the group. And here is a kind of a primal scene, and some of the actors who are all friends and neighbors of mine. What was interesting to me too about putting this together is the actors' adrenaline went way up shooting these scenes, and it was really interesting to me just the process of enacting something and the emotions that come very close. And you know, they were just very hyped up after, and very proud of their makeup too. They wore it actually for the rest of the day. And this is the last scene. And incidentally, too, the group that killed their former friends actually ended up losing their territory to another group within 5 years. So that kind of sounds a bit like many of our own battles. But it was on finishing the editing of this project that I began the ceramic work. And part of it is when I began to look up and I realized we're in the middle of this Iraq war, and that everything I'd been working on in this photographic project was really kind of happening right in unfolding in the news around me. And I began to learn how to make ceramic work because I had this idea that we could begin to kind of look at these endless cycles of war that, for me, the photographic series is kind of like an origin story to our own history of violence. And we tend to forget the last wars and always think that, like if you think of like in Iraq, how assured we were of what a short war that was going to be. Big joke, huh? And part of it, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, is some of the success that we had in '91 in the Highway of Death, which is another piece that I worked on. But in creating this work, it was heavily influenced in kind of the scale and proportion of this work that is from the Han Dynasty. These are funerary models. And the kind of simplicity but kind of accuracy of the forms felt both modern and substantial. And so this is, I recently was in China and looking at some of this work, more work of this nature. That these particular sculptures were made at the end of the Bronze Age, when ceramics began to be something that could easily be reproduced for the middle class who couldn't afford to have bronze pieces made for, because in Chinese culture you would be buried with things that were reminiscent of the life that you'd had. And so the middle class began to be able to participate in these rituals, and that's where this work kind of comes from. It was the beginning of merchant classes and different economies. So you can kind of see that in this is one of the first groupings that I did, and this is, let's see, I think it's the next picture. So this is work that's based on images of the war in Iraq, and particularly in Baghdad. And these were all made from specific buildings. And in fact, most of the work that you'll see here is based on research and is not an invented building as much as a kind of referenced and is a specific place and community that it belonged to. And here, the series, the beginning series was kind of following many of the conflicts from Israel, which is this one. This is in Rafah, in Gaza. And this is in Bani Walid and Libya. This is Saudi Arabia, the Khobar Towers. And this one is, when you encounter it, the one on the left would be the view that you'd have, and then it's when you step around, you would see the backside is completely ripped away. The next grouping of work is based on the destruction of Beirut in the July War of 2006, and the work in this series, again, are referencing specific buildings and news sources. I often use Google Earth to piece together what the buildings look like, because if you're working with photographic source materials, you have one viewpoint. So one of the ways that I try and figure out what the buildings would look like is what buildings in that city that were built at a similar era would have looked like. And this is the installation. The way that they're installed is important to me, that I had tried to create a sense of like landscape, in a sense, that these were placed on. And the empty spaces were as important as the rhythm of the buildings across the different platforms. And it also references a city grid with tables that are spaced like blocks that you walked through. There are moments in the installation where tables are propped up with brick and plastic bags. You can kind of see that in the middle table. And those are kind of the debris that you would see at a damaged site. And they also change the elevation. There are also pieces where the sculpture is flush to the surface of the table, and the piece, they're bomb pits usually that go below the table surface. And here you can see what one of those looked like. These are for the ceramics people out here. This is all kind of an iron-based clay, and the rear one has a lichen glaze. And if any of you have worked with this dark clay, it's also kind of tricky working with getting colors on it. It's such a dense color on it. But this kind of blue that was actually created with kind of almost a cream surface, or what would have been on a stoneware would have been cream, but was blue here. That's the fun thing with ceramics. Colors aren't exactly as you plan. And this is the egg. It's a brutalist egg-shaped movie theater. The architect is Joseph Philippe Caram. And it's probably the only piece that I've made that actually is of a significant building. Most everything else is that I work with are buildings that are kind of in the international style, but this particular one is still standing, and Beirut has not actually even decided what they're going to do with it. And here's a detail of it. So the buildings are all slab construction. They're built in full and destroyed on completion. I use a crowbar or BB gun to make hull damage. And while the subject of the work focuses on the destruction caused by war, specifically the damage that civilians endure, it is equally impossible to ignore how strange and interesting these images of destroyed cities are. The vast majority of the bombed buildings we see in the news belong to an international style of architecture that could just as easily be here or Miami. It has a familiar quality to it. It's also possible that its construction is less sturdy, and in a way, the destruction was more inevitable for this type of architecture. Modernity's presence can be seen in the gridded structures revealed by the destruction, as well as the directional movements within the collapses themselves. And this is another one where you have a front side and then a back side. I think with this work, there's also kind of an uncomfortable awareness of an aesthetic that's associated with art. It makes this work both compelling and uncomfortable. That I think as you navigate looking at it, you have mixed feelings in your experience with it. And I kind of think that's important. And I use the fact is that they are beautiful to look at. Images of destruction are immensely interesting. And for me, the construction of these and using this kind of beautiful presentation is also creating kind of a place where you can kind of back off a little bit from the horror of what you're looking and then return over and over again to it. It kind of creates a place of contemplation. I also think a lot about how modernisms were rooted in utopian ideas that architecture could change society, that it represented a breaking free of tradition, that beauty could be found in raw, bare materials, buildings built with practical and utilitarian sensibilities. Perhaps maybe in some ways this work is also a reflection on a failure in modernism, a failure to transform the Middle East into a vision of ourselves. And when that gets me thinking again about the poor construction of many of the buildings, the way a certain kind of modernism, but without the utopian and ideals was brought to many parts of the world, and much of it they wasn't made in the same degree of code that we'd make it here, so they've been much more vulnerable. And so the destruction has been much worse. And here's an Art Deco building, and it's a good example of what a BB gun can do to a ceramic piece, which incidentally is done in the greenware stage before it's bisqued, and it's done before it is completely dry. But it also can't have enough moisture so that it needs to have the kind of, it can't be brittle and it can't be too rubbery. So, and luckily I have a studio at home, because it would be really hard timing, these destruction, because I have to go down and look at it and feel it and make sure it's at the right place. So this is a collapsed apartment building and department store. And in this one we have, I don't actually destroy everything completely. I think that the ones in which there is more full destruction are enhanced by buildings nearby that have only taken a partial hit. It kind of feels more like the way you might imagine that an actual city block would feel. The next group of work I'm going to show you is called A Line in the Sand, and this was shown at the Chicago Cultural Center as well. And what you're seeing here is a section of the Highway of Death, and this is from 1991, Gulf War, and basically, well, maybe I'll talk a little bit as I go through here, but there was a 60-mile highway that stretched from Kuwait to Basra, and the U.S. over a weekend bombed Saddam Hussein's retreating army along this stretch of highway. And so that's the actual picture, and this is the installation that was at the Cultural Center. The platform is 12 by 30 by 6 inches, and approximately 550 cast ceramic vehicles are splayed out over the sand-covered platform. And I was interested in your encounter with the installation, that from afar you would primarily kind of notice it almost in a painterly way, of where the kind of, it's a little bit like a Joan Mitchell painting, and that you would have this kind of compression and then kind of the familiar kind of language of abstraction, of where you have kind of a sense of movement, but it would take getting up close to actually see what you were looking at. And once you're in front of the piece, you're actually looking down at it and in the same position that the plane's bombing would be. And that kind of physical sensation in your encounter, I think really activates the piece forward. And I had a lot of veterans actually who came to the show, and there was, many of them had told me that, well, many of them were reluctant to talk at first until they realized that I was serious about actually finding out about their experience. And that this particular event is interesting because when it first happened, on the news there was a sense of pride in what we'd accomplished, I think, compared to Jimmy Carter's failed rescue. In a sense, this was a win situation for the U.S., and the U.S. felt as though we did it. It was done quickly, and we got to test out all this new weaponry. But we didn't really know much about the culture. We didn't know much about who we were bombing. In fact, Saddam's had already kind of were in retreat, and they had left the day before on a northern highway, and the people taking this highway were his draftees, people who probably didn't want to be in the war in the first place. They're at the low end of the army, and they, in fact, had to bring their their families with them to cook for them and to prepare. That they were left without trucks to get out, so they stole vehicles, and there was this massive kind of escape down the only highway, and there was nowhere to go. And some of this piece, you can kind of sense some of the desperation in the people who were trying to just get out. And here's a close-up of some of the damaged vehicles. And you can see kind of the kind of strafe bombing that is kind of in the darkened, kind of blotchy areas. And if you kind of look at the sand, you can kind of see a certain kind of chaos. And I worked with quite a bit of photographs to try and get this to be fairly close. But this is, just a little section of it. I was always aware that there were 60 miles of this. And it's estimated there were over 10,000 actual vehicles destroyed on this highway. And it's assumed that most of the people died in it. There are some horrific images of people burned in the cars. So much of what happened has actually been buried or spun from what I can piece together, that during the United Nations coalition offensive in the Persian Gulf War, actually, I think I already told you that, but anyway, here's another close-up of it. 15 molds were used to create the vehicles, and they were all individually glazed and destroyed. And a burnt plywood highway snakes out over the sand. And here you can kind of see in close-up one of those kind of, where are you going to go on a lone highway and sand all around. And so that's the final piece there. At the completion of the cultural center work, Syria was already beginning to, the conflict there we were already beginning to see many images of horror and destruction coming out of Syria, but I had been working on this series around Beirut, and I knew that I wanted to work with the Syrian images. And this is a picture of in Aleppo and what one of the city blocks looks like. This is a satellite image that shows how Syria has descended into darkness over the course of the conflict, both literally and figuratively. 83% of the lights in the country are out, and in Aleppo, 97% of the lights. This was from 2015. But if you take a look on the larger image on the bottom, you can see that on the left, Aleppo is fairly bright. On the right, it's almost non-existent. The smaller images on top are a close-up of that. And so these satellite images influenced my decision to work with this black series that was recently shown at Document Gallery here in Chicago, and also at Sullivan Gallery at part of the School of the Art Institute. And these ones were presented in a more packed single table presentation. And I was really interested in the black kind of having that cloak of darkness, but it's both minimal and had a somber quality. I used variations of a gunmetal glaze that's used throughout the series. That there are small variations of where it's shinier or more metallic. This is another one where a stairwell has been opened up and stripped bare. There's kind of also, I think, an uncanny feeling that's present. The buildings have an intimacy while still seeming strange and unsettling. And here's a close-up of that stairwell. I think the thing with this work, too, is that the experience you have is further complicated as looking becomes entangled in remembered images from film, video games, and other fictions, not to mention the kind of formal language of abstraction which is embedded into the pieces as well. And I think that these cause kind of conflict in looking at them. And I think that kind of maybe that uncomfortableness is necessary because in a way we're here looking out and not there experiencing. None of us really knows what to do. We know that what's happened in this part of the world, in Syria in particular, is a disaster. Nobody wants to go to war, but we're also, I think many of us feel that that we're kind of being blind to, we have chosen to be blind to what is obviously a horrific kind of events that have happened in that country. I think that's maybe why I make the work, is to kind of in a way acknowledge that I'm aware that it's happening, that it is, even though we have many things in this country that we are have our own problems to deal with, this has not gone away and is always in the background. And it kind of makes me think a little bit of Rwanda and our failure in Rwanda to actually do something, although I certainly don't know what to do in this situation. This series that was shown at Dominican University and also Sullivan Gallery experiments with composited constructions. These are a little bit different than some of the other work because I'm not working in making them with a specific building in mind, that they come from multiple sources. And what I've done with them is I have deliberately kind of worked with the light well to create a text that can be seen from the top. And if you look carefully, that there's a G on the top of this building. The next one is an E. I'm not spelling them in order, you'll have to guess. And there's an N here, and the bomb pit is basically an O. But let's just go back here. And the point isn't to get that it spells gone, but that you might notice it. And it is basically set within a square, kind of like Robert Indiana's Love painting, the L-O-V-E, so it's going around that way. And the last work that I'm going to show you was shown recently at the Ukrainian Museum of, or Institute of Modern Art. That's what it's called, Ukrainian Museum Institute of Modern Art. These are, this particular material is a source material for most of the project. And as you notice, this entire city, I mean, like 60% of Homs has been destroyed, and over 1 million people have left, and the city looks like it's in shreds and tatters. And I wanted to kind of work with a much rougher construction of the buildings in response to the images that I was seeing. When looking at a lot of the source material, I'm often struck by the weight and fragility of the architectural remains that are still standing. It's almost unbelievable that they still, that they could even be in the kind of, they're like plates and damage, and it's, here's a detail. There's also kind of a dustiness that seems to cover almost all the buildings, and so a lot of the colors that I'm using have a kind of that kind of quality to them. And as in most of my projects, the lack of any human presence seems to take on a ghost-like appearance. And this one has the kind of feel of the way weather kind of further damages the kind of soaking and damp and sludge-like quality of something of the dust and water mixing. That's a detail. What I think you'll also notice is that there's a particular color to these, and this project was designed with the idea of dusk being the dominant color theme. So there are purples and blues and grays and browns, and most of them kind of are lit from one side, and it's mostly the upper stories where you get a little bit of light hitting the tops. I think one like this you can particularly see, and it seemed to me like the appropriate color for this series, which it seems as though in some ways the world may have forgotten, but maybe there's still some last hope, that it will get rebuilt, and it'll have another day, I guess. So there's ones like this with the grid structure with the walls all blown out, or this particular building where half of the front is gone, and you see a little bit of a lavender wall that might have belonged to a bedroom. And this is the last one. It's an ongoing series. I've got maybe 14 of them finished. I hope to have at least twice that much. It seems very depressing, sorry. But it is partly because it's like, it's awful, and what should we do? I mean, I'm an artist, I'm not a politician. I don't have the answer. I know that what I see is wrong, that there are people's lives that have been, we'll never get them back, that they're, regardless of whatever kind of politics that you have, it's suffering. So I guess maybe I just hope that someone smarter than me will figure it out. Thank you.